Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Dave's Math channel. I'm your host, David Tear, and this is my continuing feature on the Math Lovers book, a 3-volume series I wrote from 2019 to 2022 that's available on Amazon.com. In case you guys are interested in purchasing any one of these volumes or any combination thereof, you can buy it both in Kindle or in paperback. And you can either search for my name, David Taylor, or the name of the book, My Math Lover's Book. I think it's a good read. But anyway, like I do every Saturday, today I'm going to feature a biography of a famous mathematician. I have these in at the end of volume 2, and I do them. There's 80. There's a total of 80 biographies in this volume, and they're listed chronologically. And I've been doing this the 12th week I've done this, so I'm up to the 12th out of 80. And that one is Fibonacci, who lived from around 1170 to around 1250. We don't know the exact years, but anyway, here's a picture of him. He went by a lot of different names. His first name was Leonardo, but I think most people just know him as Fibonacci. And the thing he's most well known for, I'm sure most of you guys know about these already. I already talked about them, Fibonacci numbers. And here's just the first few Fibonacci numbers. A very simple sequence to define. You just start with a 0 and a 1, and then every next element of the sequence is a sum of the previous two, as shown. And this sequence infinite. And there's a lot of interesting things you can do with Fibonacci numbers. I talked about this as well. There's a thing called the Fibonacci spiral shown on the bottom. Um, and, there's also things like the golden ratio, and there's also closely related sequences. There's another sequence very closely related Fibonacci sequence called the Lucas sequence. This was discovered much later by a French mathematician, 19th century. 19th century French mathematician Edouard Lucas. Uh, but the interesting thing about Fibonacci is that even though he's most well known for Fibonacci numbers, as a matter of fact, Fibonacci numbers are so useful that there's even a journal devoted to them. It started in 1963. It's called the Fibonacci Quarterly, and they have annual conferences, and you can publish papers, and most of the papers people write are closely related to Fibonacci numbers or Fibonacci sequence or stuff closely related. I've published 3 papers myself in the Fibonacci Quarterly, and I also like solving their problems every issue. They come out every 3 months, and there's problems and solutions at the end of every issue. I like to solve them. So it's kind of a fun journal, but I'm digressing. What else did Fibonacci do besides discover? He didn't even discover the Fibonacci sequence, by the way. We don't know exactly when the Fibonacci sequence was discovered. We know that it was discovered at least as early as around 600 A.D. in India. The Indians were using Fibonacci numbers back in the 7th century. But what Fibonacci did, which I think was an even greater accomplishment than introducing Fibonacci numbers to Europe, was that he wrote a book called Liber Abaci, and I have a picture of a page from that book. This is back in 1202, early 13th century, before they had printing. Printing by I'll tell you, it was a handwritten book. I think around 200 pages, and there was only 2 pages of this book, believe it or not, devoted to the Fibonacci sequence. And he came up with a Fibonacci sequence as an exercise involving rabbit breeding. I'm not going to go into this. I did this in a previous lecture, but that's how he introduced Fibonacci numbers. But what I think is even more important about this book is he basically introduced our modern math notation in this book, because I mean, this was already known. I think a lot of this was already known in India and in Persia, and he must have brought back a lot of that knowledge that was already known. For instance, he introduced zero and our decimal system to Europe. And, before him, hardly anybody in Europe was using the decimal, number system. And we're so used to it today. it's a little hard to imagine people not using it. But I think throughout at least most of the early Middle Ages, I think even after him, I think most people in Europe were still using Roman numerals, which were very, very cumbersome. It was a face valued system rather than a place valued system, and it didn't lend itself well at all to doing math. So I think Liber Abaci was a really groundbreaking book because it introduced our modern way of doing arithmetic with the decimal system. I think he introduced shift and add multiplication as well as long division. That's how everybody in grade school learns how to do math, and we owe that to Fibonacci. And I think that was actually a greater accomplishment than the Fibonacci numbers. Not to knock the Fibonacci numbers. The Fibonacci numbers are pretty amazing. But, I just think because of these two accomplishments, I'd say that Fibonacci was a first rate mathematician. And another thing I mentioned is there weren't a lot of mathematicians during the Middle Ages, at least in Europe there weren't. And I think he himself was a friar, which was what they called monks back then. He was working for the church, like just about everybody else in Europe at the time. If you were a mathematician, and, in Europe in the Middle Ages, you couldn't get a job as a mathematician. You had to get a job working for the church, like everybody did, if they could get a job at all. So, but he was a really great mathematician, and I salute him. And anyway, that concludes my video on Fibonacci. Thank you for watching. Long live math, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.